Hey, everybody, and welcome today. I hope everyone's having a wonderful Tuesday after the Halloween holiday. I know just how hard it can be to recover from that, but welcome to Beer Projects. Now, I'm sure some of you who've been following CBP for a while have seen my face, probably are tired of me at this point, but for those of you who have not, I'm sure that you're asking yourself, who is this guy? And why should I care about literally anything that he has to say about anything? Well, luckily for you, I happen to have a slide for that. My name is Aaron Gore, and I'm the Director of Sales and Marketing for Beer 30, as well as the Vice President of the American Craft Beer Hall of Fame and the co-founder of Craft University, the educational platform that is 100% free. But outside of that, I've spent most of my adult life in the craft beverage industry. It's been 6 years as a full-time consultant, and even within my roles here today, I'm very fortunate to work with breweries all over the world, a variety of different scales, a variety of different age of the business, and really be able to help them make the most out of their business and really make this industry just a little more sustainable and a little more professional. But one of the things that time and time again I've noticed is not necessarily happening is breweries don't always do the best job of planning. A lot of times they have a tendency to just brew beer and put it out there and then hope that they can sell it before it expires. And truthfully, that's a bit of a shame because that leaves you vulnerable to all sorts of challenges. It costs you valuable time and money in an industry where time and money are two of the resources that are so often in short supply. Now, a lot of this can be mitigated with just a little bit of planning, and that's what we're going to be talking about here today. Today, we're going to be talking about taking the principles of good project management and applying it to your beer. Launching your beer, releasing it to the market and making sure you're doing so in a way that makes the success of your beers more predictable, more reliable, more effective, and more profitable. Very important. But before we can really dive into project management, we really have to define project management. Now, one disclaimer, today we're going to be talking about how to use project management to support the release of new beers, the actual launch of new products into the market, defining your portfolio. But these same principles can be applied to a lot of areas of the business. So don't take any of this as being limited to just this one use case. It's an example. These same principles can apply to anything that has a result that you're trying to achieve and team members who need to work together in order to do so. But let's define project management for a minute so we can understand what we're all speaking about. So what is project management? Simply put, project management is the planning, the organizing, the execution of a plan to achieve specific goals within a particular time frame, budget, and requirements. Now, on the surface, that sounds extremely simple, almost a little obvious, and I can understand that. And there are definitely going to be occasions where, some sort of elaborate plan is going to feel out of place or too much. If you're releasing one barrel of beer to the tap room, check dark lager that you and every other brewer in town is going to drink and literally no one else, love that style, does not sell, then you probably don't need some sort of elaborate project management in order to sustain that. But don't overread that lesson. Because far too often I hear from brewers that, they really just don't need any of this. You brew a beer, you release a beer, what's the problem? You brew, release, you sell, you put it in the tap room. Why do we need anything more than that? Well, that's because poor project management carries with it some very well-defined, very understandable hazards that you have to keep in mind. And the first is just a lack of clarity. Who's on first? Who is responsible for doing what? Because far too often in breweries, information can get siloed. The brewery, the tap room, the sales side, the marketing side, finance, ownership, they aren't necessarily talking to each other the way that they should be. That information isn't passing to and fro. And so what beer is coming up, what is in it, what the actual qualitatives and quantitatives of it are going to be isn't getting communicated to marketing, who doesn't necessarily know what they're trying to describe or when it's going to be released, or or even have the ability to create supporting materials. Sales doesn't know what they need to be telling their wholesalers or their retail accounts about. Your tap room doesn't know what they're going to need to schedule events around. All of this information is not passing between these departments, and so without a plan, it's very easy for things to not only not happen, but even if they do happen with delays. And delays cost money, because you can produce a beer, but if your sales team doesn't know about it, then you have a couple of options. You can either just put it out there and hope for the best, or you can sit there and wait while they do the pre-sale process that they could have been doing while that beer was fermenting. If you need label approvals, that's something that could have been happening in line with production of beer that may not be happening because your marketing and your production teams just weren't talking to each other and weren't playing from the same playbook. Being able to build a clarity, being able to build a central source of information and responsibility so that everyone knows what they're intended to do and when, goes an enormous way towards ensuring that those delays don't happen and that they don't cost you that time and money that you already don't have enough of. But it's also important to be able to get as many voices in the room as possible. I've mentioned brewers quite a bit so far, and that's because this is an industry that was largely built by people who really loved brewing beer. That's why they wanted to open a brewery. That's why a lot of people get into this. Even a lot of the people who are working in other roles have dreams of or originally intended to brew beer. And that creates a dynamic where a lot of times we let the brewers really decide what's going to happen for the entire business. This is not a knock on brewers. They're incredibly talented, passionate people who do not get the respect and a lot of times don't get the compensation they deserve. But you can't ask your brewer to also decide what's happening in the market or what needs to happen within the tap room or what your financial constraints are. You need those stakeholders to all have a voice because they really are all bringing unique information, unique insights, and unique ideas to the table that can be synthesized into the best path forward for the business. Good project planning allows you to work off of what's actually happening instead of just what's actually feeling, getting away from those vibes and towards something that's driven more by data and more by intention. Also make sure that you avoid simple mistakes. It's very, very easy for things that may not have been intended, may have been completely understandable to happen, to have very real consequences for your business. If grain doesn't get ordered because communication broke down, that could impact your brew day. If that brew day needs to shift, that could impact not only future beers that need to be produced, but it might also mean that you miss your window of pickup for your wholesaler for that month even. Or maybe even just push it back for a few days, but that could impact when your events were planned to support that launch in the market, could impact whether or not your marketing team is able to get labels not only approved but ordered in time. All of these are things that need to happen, and the more that you plan, the more you can keep those things from happening and costing you money and costing you time. I think you're starting to understand that there's a theme here. But how do we execute? How do we actually put project planning into place within our brewery? What does that even look like, and what does that even mean? Well, the first thing is we need to make sure that we have the tools to do so. Now, these tools can take a lot of different forms because there's a lot of different pieces that go into it. Brewery management software, it's no secret, I work for Beer 30, is one such brewery management software. It runs the operational side of the business, the brew house, the sales, a lot of your data management, inventory management. And that's a wonderful place to start, whether it's ours or with someone else. Throughout a lot of this, you'll see Beer 30 used as an example, but whatever you are using, I hope that it has the information that you need to be able to pull and use to apply these same principles. And for the good softwares, it largely should. But even if you're using spreadsheets, make sure that those spreadsheets are as accurate as possible and have all the information that you need to track. Because one of the challenges of using Excel or using Google Sheets to run your business is a lot of times there's plenty of different places you have to put information. And that means a couple of things. A, they might not always tie or reconcile between each other. And B, there's a lot more opportunity for human error. But if you do have a system that works for you, that also can work within good project management, regardless of if it is spreadsheets or a dedicated software. Point of sale system is also going to have a lot of the info that you really need, that sales data, what's selling, what's working, what isn't, what your margins are coming through the tap room. Because for a lot of us, our tap room is our largest customer. It's our most important customer to be sure. And whether it's an internal one or not, that means that not only do those taproom managers need to have a seat at the table and need to be a key stakeholder that we're hearing from, but we also need to understand what's actually happening on the ground within that venue. And then last but not least is the one that's kind of unique to project management, and that's dedicated project management software. Now, a lot of these are very affordable. We use Monday.com here at Beer 30, but I actually use Asana even to organize a lot of the things in my personal life, just as a priority management tool, keeping track of everything I need to do in a week. These can be very useful tools even outside of the context of your brewery, but what they really help do is organize different tasks, different stages, and different responsibilities, and keep everybody working from a central source of information and a single source of dependencies and workflows. It really goes a long way towards keeping everyone on the same page. But even if you're not using something like that, you can build something that'll at least get the job done on Excel, on Google Sheets. Just make sure that you're maintaining it and that you're not allowing it to drift, because bad data is worse than no data at all. One specific tool, though, I'm going to go ahead and call out is actually going to be Gantt charts. Now, all a Gantt chart really means is that you have date along the top, you have a list, in this case, of tanks for your brewery on one side of it. But importantly, you're using this as an opportunity to lay out periods of time in which anything is being either occupied or done. And you can use this even for managing different areas of responsibility. Instead of tanks, this could be departments, this could be individuals, this could be roles. But even if you are looking to juggle just what's being fermented in what tank at any given time, what your actual residency is, what you have upcoming from a task management standpoint, Gantt charts are very easy to build out, not just within software, but also within Excel. And we do have, as part of our Craft University program upcoming, you will be able to get your hands on this exact tank scheduler done in Google Sheets for anybody to access for free. So definitely sign up if you'd like to get your hands on that. Make some of this planning that I'm going to be talking about a lot easier. But there's a lot of different philosophies surrounding project management, and they all have different applications for different types of projects that you're trying to accomplish. But within the brewery, almost everything that you're going to be doing is really going to benefit from what's called critical path project planning. Really fancy name, very basic concept. Without getting too deep into the technical side of it, all this really means is focusing on the pathway from end to end on everything that needs to get done to go from start to finish, and ensuring that you're tracing the longest path between those points. Now, here's how you do so. First step is to take whatever you're trying to accomplish. In this case, releasing a new beer. Let's say, just for purposes of example, you're releasing a new flagship IPA. Divide everything that needs to be done for that into stages. Don't worry too much about how granular you're getting. We'll talk a little bit about that, but break it into stages of activities that need to happen. And then within that, break it into individual tasks, things that need done to get to the finish line. Then tie those tasks and figure out which ones are dependent on what else happening. You can't design a label until you know what beer that you're brewing. You can't get a label approved until the label is designed. You can't get labels ordered until the label is approved. So these are a series of dependencies that cross from that production side of what beer is getting made all the way through into the marketing side or the operations side of ordering those labels and making or designing those labels, ordering those labels and getting them approved. You now understand what is dependent on what in order to happen. Key step towards making sure that nothing gets missed. It's also important to set key milestones. These would be stages where everything has to be done ahead of that in order to do a final release. Biggest one is going to be when a beer is actually packaged and ready to go out to market. There's certain things that just need to be done ahead of that until all of those are done, you just can't physically pack. You have to make sure that you have cans inventory. You have to make sure that you have time scheduled for the canning run. You have to make sure that the labels are ordered and ready to go. And that means that they also need to be approved. That's a milestone that you can't cross without making sure that all those things are done. Earlier one would even be in deciding what you're going to be producing, which is still an important part of the project. These are things that really act as gates to ensure that you're not getting over your skis or getting too far ahead or behind of what needs done within the project. And then you take that timeline everything that you've just defined, excuse me, and track out the longest amount of time it would take to complete all those tasks and stages with a little bit of fudge factor built in. Now, this doesn't mean some improbably large timeline, but why do we say the longest instead of the shortest? Well, it's the longest because we want to make sure that we're not setting ourselves up for failure, assuming everything's going to go right, that nothing's going to slide, that nothing's going to change. Sometimes you get a stuck fermentation. Sometimes your grain just doesn't come in exactly when it's supposed to. You're waiting a day or two and things need to shift. These are inevitable. And you want to make sure that you're giving everyone enough time to know exactly what the longest amount of time this project's going to take. That way you can beat that project if everything does go well, rather than feeling like you're behind the eight ball and people are missing or over planning for the future because they assumed everything was going to go right the first time. Plan for a little failure and make sure that you understand what that long pathway is if everything that you've defined needs to happen and takes a little longer than you expect it to. And then the most important piece at all, just make sure everyone's communicating. Communication is critical in any sort of workplace, and especially in a small business, because for a lot of us, the one thing that we're always going to have is more things that need done than we're ever going to have time to actually do any of them. By communicating with each other, we can not only make sure that everyone understands where we're at, what may be holding us up, or what may be ready to go, but also areas that we could use help or support. Now, when everyone's wearing a lot of hats, when everyone's playing a game of competing priorities, the more that we can keep that communication open, the better we can focus on prioritizing together, ensure that the things that are the most important for the business as a whole are still being accomplished and still being supported. But what about the actual basic stages that we're looking at for the launch of a beer? What do those typically look like in practice? Well, the first is going to be planning. Very simple, very straightforward. That is figuring out exactly what we are going to make and going about that. We're going to talk about each of these in more detail, but next is going to be the production side, actually producing the beer itself and or the product. I guess it could be Cannabev, it could be cider, it could be seltzer, it could be spirits. From there, the actual launch, putting that product into market and making sure that it's supported in that, making sure that it's successful as possible the moment that it is available to your customers. And then the piece that gets missed a lot of times is monitoring. Just because you put a beer out in the market doesn't mean that your work is done. A lot of times there's still the need to really make sure that you're checking your success, evaluating how you did, and then not only internalizing that feedback, but even providing any sort of continuing care, continuing support for that product in the market that it needs. And that's just as critical as the rest of this. So understand that the project doesn't stop the moment that the beer ships. It doesn't stop until the moment that the beer is all gone, or at least gone enough to where you feel like you've done as much as you possibly can. And from there, your project's complete. Sounds easy, right? In a lot of ways it is. But let's talk in a little more detail each of these stages, exactly what that entails. Entails, not inhales. Words are hard on a Tuesday. Well, first step, the planning. Deciding what you actually want to make. And the single biggest mistake that breweries too often make is that we let brewers just decide what they are going to produce without any real feedback or any real rhyme or reason in a lot of cases. And that is frankly exactly backwards from how you should be determining what's in your portfolio. Now, none of this is a criticism whatsoever of brewers. Brewers, like I said before, are incredibly talented and critical members of your team. But if your brewer is the most in touch person in your entire company with what's happening in the market or with what's happening with your customers, then that means one of two things. Either they're not doing the job that you're paying them to do, or your sales and tap room and marketing people aren't doing the jobs that you're paying them to do. Because all of those things are dependent on market signals. We rely on those market signals to make sure that we're brewing stuff that the market wants, that our customers or non-customers want, and not just making things that we hope are going to be successful or that we just want to brew without any real plan for making sure that someone downstream actually takes them off the shelf. You need to make sure that you understand the market and those market signals. And that's why you need to have everyone in the room, and not just sales, not just marketing, not just tap room, but also if you have a finance head or an accountant who's responsible for holding the purse strings. They need to let you know what you can and cannot do based on just cash in the bank. All of these things help define what the problem statement is, what you're trying to accomplish with this beer that you're creating. Because if the answer is, well, we don't know what we are creating this beer to do, then why are you making it at all? You need to define the problem statement, and then that is what's handed to the brewer to turn into an answer, to turn into a solution. And that is where the real talent comes from, because at the end of the day, any good brewer can make great beer. A great brewer can make great beer consistently within constraints, whether financial or material or technical, in order to do what needs to be done in order to make the business as successful as possible. And those constraints are critical. That's actually the most important thing to define. What can't you do will help bring you clarity as to what you can do. Now, if you can order the Cadillac of malt and the Cadillac of hops and the best brewing equipment in the world, then sure, you can probably make some great beer, but there's likely to be some financial constraints. And that could be the actual cash you have on hand, what you can afford to spend, but also, how expensive can this beer be and still reasonably be expected to sell? I mean, you can probably make an amazing beer that's going to cost $35 a 4-pack. I don't think anyone's going to buy it. So you need to understand what margin you need to hit, what revenue you need to hit, while at the same time understanding what you can feasibly charge within the market. That's a financial constraint. Could be a technical constraint. Might be something about your equipment that prevents you from doing certain things or enables you to do certain things. Maybe you have a kettle that has some issues with the port that disable you from actually doing heavy hopping regimes on the hot side. That's actually been an issue I've run into with previous breweries that I've run. Not super common now, thankfully, but a challenge you may have. Maybe you don't have the capability of doing decoction mashing or cereal mashing or turbine mashing, and you want to, but that's a very real constraint. Maybe you don't have a hop back, and that's critical for what you're trying to accomplish. That's a technical constraint that prevents you from doing certain things. It helps define what you can do. And then the last one is temporal constraints. That's residency time. That's what you're able to make from a time standpoint. Maybe you need a beer in, a month, 2 months, and you can't afford to do something barrel aged that's going to take a year and a half to be ready to go. Well, hopefully not that long. You definitely got it in the barrel too long if you're going a year and a half, but that's neither here nor there. Maybe you can't afford to do a full traditional lager. The residency time is just too long, and you have other beers that you need to rotate through those tanks. Now you have some decisions to make. You try to find a way to make the lager quicker, or are lagers just not the answer to the problem that you're trying to solve? Those constraints are also critical. And one of the key things that you can use to help out with this process is going to be the sales data that you have access to. And that can be from, yes, your spreadsheets, or if you're using QuickBooks for invoicing, but it's a lot more useful if you're able to use your taproom sales data and your ERP or your brewery management software's data to really help give you not just the raw data, but also help you interpret it and find opportunities or find challenges within. And we'll talk about what some of that looks like as well. But the key conceit of all of this is we're trying to make sure that we're not sitting on a bunch of inventory. Because the moment that you choose to brew a beer, you're effectively parking the cash that you spent on that. And you're saying two things. You're making a bet. You're making a bet that A, you're going to be able to at least earn back enough to justify having made that beer in the first place. Because here's the thing about beer. Beer is a product that does expire. Doesn't expire as quickly as milk, but it does expire. That's a disadvantage we have versus spirits, and largely versus wine. And that means that we have a limited window to sell it. So you're making a bet that you're going to be able to sell it, but you're also making a bet that this is the best place to put your money, because there's a lot of places that are going to be begging for a few dollars thrown their way, whether your personnel, whether your tap room, whether events, whether just the debt that you owe, just getting a business up and running. And the moment that you put that cash into inventory, it's no longer available to you. You need to understand that it's going to turn around and make you more money than any of the other places that you could put that cash. So make sure that you're keeping that in mind. We want to keep inventory as low as possible. Now, we talked a little bit about those sales, those COGS insights, and I'm someone who's very passionate about costs, very passionate about COGS. In my time as a consultant, COGS kills more breweries than almost any other single factor. We spend a lot of time as an industry so focused on the quality of our beer, and beer quality is important, but that's just the cost of doing business these days. That is the entry fee. You must have good beer to really be able to survive in this industry in 2025. But COGS is what kills breweries. So you need to have a true understanding of your revenues and the margins, those costs removed from what you're actually bringing in. And it's important to remember that revenue doesn't go in the bank. Profits do. Profits are what you're actually keeping. Profits are what you've actually gained, and that's critical. But there are times where prioritizing revenues or prioritizing profits become more or less important. Now, what does that mean? Take, for example, if you are a brewery that has tons of excess capacity. Everything you produce is selling, but you have plenty of room, plenty of volume you could turn around. You're not brewing nearly as often as you could. You have empty tanks. Almost anything that you put into those tanks is going to be a better use than them sitting empty, because as long as that beer is selling and is making you some margin, it's better than that tank sitting empty and making you no margin. So anything you can do to prioritize that revenue, that will increase your margin, even if your margin on a unit by unit basis is relatively small. Because the more that you are using those tanks, you do have money that you spent on those tanks. You might even still be paying off. That means that your beer is relatively more expensive when that capital expenditure, those tanks are sitting empty. The more you're using them, as long as it is net positive, that's actually going to be better off for your business. So as long as you're able to sell it, even if you're not selling it for as much as you'd like to otherwise, that can benefit the business. That's a good thing to prioritize. It's the exact opposite if you start reaching capacity, if you start getting to the point where you may not be able to brew anymore in your current system, because now you have a couple of options. The first is to buy new tanks. That's additional CapEx. That's very, very expensive, and you might not even have the space for it, even if you wanted to do that. You can also go ahead and focus on making sure that your beer that you are producing is as effective as possible for you, is capturing as much margin as possible for you, and you're keeping your costs relatively low, and you're able to capture as much additional incremental profits as you can. But that means you have to understand your costs. That means you have to understand what you can charge as well. A lot of our users at Beer 30, just being able to visualize your tanks, being able to understand exactly what goes where, being able to see where your loss is happening, they can squeeze about 10 to 15% additional production volume out of their brew house. But, if you're growing fast enough, you might need 25 or 50%. So the more that you're able to really focus on getting as much out of every barrel of beer you're producing, that's that much longer until you need to reinvest in tanks or a new facility or eat into your margin with something like co-manufacturing. So know whether or not you're trying to optimize for revenues or you're trying to optimize for profits. It's also good to understand what types of products are doing the best in the market. If you notice that consistently IPAs do really well for you, and every time that you introduce a new one, then you see your sales increase still further as a whole, then that tells you something. The market signal is that your customers want IPAs. That can be something you lean further into and further accentuate. It could also be one of the reasons why bucketing your brands, doing brand grouping throughout your recipes, whether that's formal or informal, can go a long way for you, because I know and you know that a blonde ale and a cream ale and a Kolsch and a Pilsner are all, very different, very unique, and very beautiful beer styles. But the average consumer, that's all fizzy yellow beer flavored beer. It's for the same thing. So you need to understand whether people are looking for that category or whether they're just looking for something to fill that category, because there's a chance that you introduce a new IPA and it might sell incredibly well, but all of your other IPAs see their sales drop as a result. Product cannibalization is something you have to be concerned about when you're thinking what you should be producing. But none of this data, none of this information is nearly so valuable as actually being able to Reach out to the people who you are selling to, not just customers, but retailers. And if you're going through wholesalers, especially your distributors, and do as much pre-selling and get as much feedback from them as you possibly can, because those are the direct market signals. That's where you can find what sorts of products that you're producing that they want, and understand how much, so that you can forecast your performance and understand how much you need to produce, which means how much raw materials you need to order, which means what your business is going to be looking like a month, 2 months, 3 months down the line. Now, those sales commitments, you're not always going to be able to get them. You're not always going to be able to get people to hold to them, but they're still the best way of making sure that any beer you produce has a home, that keeps your inventory as small as it can be without ever missing a sales order. And that means two things. The first is that means that you can keep your cash on hand as low as possible, because the further out you go, the more that you're going to have to be sure that you're keeping as much cash on hand as you need to be able to cover that gap in case anything does happen, or even just for seasonal variations. But it also allows you to make sure that you're as responsive to the market as you can be, because if you're putting a bunch of cash into inventory and you're sitting on it and you're hoping that it's going to sell, and you don't have a plan for it, and it's just sitting there taking up space in your inventory, then not only is that cash wrapped up, but that's kegs wrapped up. That's less opportunity to reinvest. That's smaller margins that you're capturing, which means that you need to charge more in order to capture the same amount of actual money coming in. If you're turning beer over quicker, that gives you more opportunity to charge more and have more pricing power, or to charge less and use that to really increase your velocity, because you don't need to see that cash turnover quite as quickly. You have a lot more flexibility on pricing power if you're able to keep your inventories lower. But now we've produced our beer. Now we need to focus on launching it. Well, just completing production isn't the end of the process. We talked about that already, but it's not even the beginning, because there's a lot of stuff that has to happen before you actually release the beer. And part of creating a successful project plan is making sure that all those stakeholders are not only involved, but that the things they can be doing parallel to the beer being produced are also happening, and are also laid out, and also have all of their dependencies tracked. We talked a little bit about labels and the need to focus on label designs, label approvals before, and all of that needs to also be built into your project plan, and it can be happening simultaneously with everything happening in the brew house. But one of the key things that sales and marketing do need to understand, and the tap room as well, is what is the date no later than your beer can be ready to go. Now, why no later than the last date that beer feasibly, assuming nothing goes grotesquely wrong, there's nothing terribly unexpected, when it will be available for? Two reasons. The first is it allows them to plan their own schedules and their own areas of responsibility, because they have many things that they do have to accomplish within their own jobs. Knowing when the product is going to be available and at the absolute latest date it could be lets them plan out their own priorities and their own sense of urgent versus important. But it also means that they're able to get that stuff done ahead of time and have that ready to go. It means that they're able to create a go-to-market strategy, and they know that even if that beer is produced early, if you committed to a week or 2 weeks after that as the no later than date, then that's when they need to be prepared to launch. Now, on the marketing side, that means that they're going to have sell sheets. That means they're going to have marketing materials, social media schedules, already all booked, all ready to go, table tents, what have you. Taproom side, if they need to set up an event, they know that even if that beer's ready ahead of time, at least it won't be not ready, which is a far worse result. And for the sales side, it means that they have a date that they can predictably set shipments to for your wholesalers, for your retailers, so that those pre-sales and pre-commitments, those illustrate trust with those customers. Something that they know that if they set that commitment, they're going to get it in, and they're not going to have sliding dates in the market. Their staff isn't going to be thinking something's getting released when it's not and talking up accounts for it. They're able to do their jobs effectively, knowing when it will be released by. And that means that sometimes it is better to push that date a little bit and have beer sitting for a couple of weeks or even a month, rather than release it before you have the ability to actually support it in the market. So make sure you're hedging on the outside, and make sure that whatever date sales and marketing are committing your customers to, are committing events to, are committing materials to, that you know Barring some sort of disaster, the beer will be ready and will be ready for release when that happens. And if anything changes over the course of that period, those changes need to be communicated. And this goes both ways because if something happens, for example, with label approvals that could potentially delay launch, then sales needs to be apprised of it. And so does operations if they're doing the orders on the actual physical labels. If the ABV changes because maybe attenuation wasn't as high as you were expecting or was somehow higher than you were expecting, then that may be something that needs to be reflected on that label or on those materials that are getting in front of your wholesalers. If volumes change, maybe you didn't get as much yield as you're expecting, then some of those pre-sale commitments might need to change accordingly, and sales will need to communicate that. These are things that need to be communicated backwards and forwards and needs to be communicated frequently. Just like we talked about before, communication, clear communication is everything. It's also important to make sure that that pre-selling is happening. We've talked about it a couple of times here, but make sure that you're getting as much of that information as possible from the market and making sure that's communicated back to the brew team, because not only does that help inform how much they brew, it also critically informs your splits. It's one of the hardest things to get right on productions. One of the chief things that leads to inventory bloat is packaging in the wrong formats, whether that's different can types, whether that's different keg sizes, whether that's even just the draft versus can or bottle split itself. You need to make sure you have as much of an understanding of how much you need of each of those as possible. Otherwise, you could have the right beer in the wrong format, and it either turns into a costly in time and sometimes even in materials exercise of converting that packaging, or it just means that you aren't able to really get it where it needs to go when it needs to get there. That's not helping anyone. And when you're doing those pre-sales, when you're doing those pre-commitments, again, make sure that you're not committing to any dates that you don't know that product's going to be available, because everyone downstream of you is going to be setting their schedules by that as well. And for a lot of them, particularly wholesalers or large retailers, it's easier for them to just drop something they've been planning than to keep waiting and possibly pushing other things that they might have committed to as well. So be careful about your dates and make sure that you know you're going to be able to execute barring any sort of disaster. And if things do change, getting ahead of those with your customers, with your wholesalers, and internally as well as early as possible. Now, when marketing and sales are working together, there's an enormous amount of power to support beer and make sure that not only do you understand what's going to be sold, but you understand exactly what the future opportunity is and what you're able to do from there to continue that momentum. But they need to make sure they're working in conjunction, and both need to be working in conjunction with the brew house as well. Now, I mentioned earlier that a lot of these lessons aren't necessarily going to be super important for tiny little runs, but one thing I will say as an exception is that the launch, even of smaller beers, is something that you should still be supporting every single time. Because the nice thing about your tap room is it's also the area where you have the most control. It's also the area where it's the most affordable for you to go ahead and support these beers, irrespective of how much you actually have to sell. Because at the end of the day, you're in control of almost everything other than the number of people who walk in the door. So something as simple as a social media post or some table tents, putting it up on a digital display and just letting people know that something is coming, that gives that beer the best chance to not only sell. You could probably sell it regardless, but to really create an experience and allow it to really enhance things. Otherwise, if you can sell any beer you put up, why are you going to bother diversifying the raw materials you need to bring in to produce a new beer at all? Make sure people know about it, make sure that it's well supported, and make sure that you're still monitoring its success and adjusting as necessary so that the future, even if those beers make up 1-2% of your total sales, that adds up quickly when you're doing releases on the regular and can really make a total impact on not only your business, but the experience your customers have in the long run. And that last piece, just set goals. Make sure you understand what you're trying to accomplish. I said before, if you don't know what problem you're trying to solve with a beer, then you probably shouldn't be making it. That holds true, but understand not just what you think your customers can commit to, but set goals for what you think you can do with that beer. That's going to take some time to get right, and you're going to be guessing early on, but try to understand that if you can only commit to half of a full batch, and you think that you can sell the rest of it over the next 2 months, then that's something that you should be committing to, and you should be committing to supporting, and you should be willing to take a look and see whether or not you achieve that goal, or if you need to revisit and whether or not that's realistic. That can help really define what success looks like internally for your business, but also help with the process of iterating towards a more successful launch in the future. And iterating is what we're trying to do. We want to make sure that the moment that the product hits the market, that's not the end. I've said it a few times now, but there is an enormous amount of work that needs to be done, even well beyond that, even well beyond when that initial batch has been sold, because there's a few things that you need to do. The first is you need to understand what success looks like for you. We talked earlier about understanding if you're prioritizing revenues versus profits, but you need to understand that, is it important that you sell 75% of this batch with the initial order? Is it something that you think you can do more continuing sales? Are there certain accounts that you really want to see this placed in? Is this something that you really want to be a taproom exclusive? Understand what success looks like, set those metrics, and make sure that you're able to refer to them and track that success post-launch. Because at the end of the day, none of this is about finding blame. And that's something I see far too often in small business, in life, in families, and friendships. We're very quick to look for people to blame when things don't go wrong or don't go as right as we would hope. And that's not a particularly useful reflex, because at the end of the day, it can be very cathartic to find someone to blame for why a beer didn't sell as well as everyone thought it was going to. But it's far more important, far more effective to focus on why, and to build better systems, to build better planning, better project plans for the future, to ensure that even if someone is having a bad week or a bad month, or you just had bad information or bad assumptions, that all of that is far less important in determining whether or not that future project is successful. People fall down. It happens. Better systems help cover for that and help ensure that even if people are well-meaning and they just are having a really rough week, or something just doesn't go according to plan, that you're still able to be as successful as you can be. And that means iterating. That means taking that information, taking the feedback from the market and from your customers, and using that to build better into the future. Your customers are going to be the best people to tell you what they're looking for. And they may even be looking for stuff that, and when I say customers, I even mean non-customers, prospective customers. They can even tell you about things that maybe you're not doing yet, that they'd love to see from you. Or things that other companies are doing that, they'd really like to see your company also do, or do with your unique style. Or maybe they can even tell you about opportunities that you didn't even think of, that are just being completely unserved. Styles, beverages, concepts, branding, stories, experiences that you didn't even know your market needed. It might not always be obvious. Henry Ford was famous for saying that if I had asked people, they would have told me they needed a faster horse, and that's what led to the creation of the car. But what he was really getting at was that feedback, that what people wanted was to be able to get from point A to point B quicker and more comfortably. And that helps you define what you need to be producing, but also get feedback from your team. How'd this feel? What fell down and why? And how can we prevent that from happening in the future, irrespective of the people involved? What was uncomfortable? What was successful? What do we want to make sure that we're replicating in the future? And what were the friction points that we felt like were making it harder for us to get this project successfully to completion? The important thing is to make sure that everyone is able to provide that feedback, and that you internalize it and use that to iterate towards a better process in the future. I'm going to skip down a little bit, because debate really is a key to any successful workplace. You're not looking for homogeny. You're not looking for people to all just nod their head and say yes to whatever the loudest person in the room has to say. You need to encourage debate and even argument about what you're going to produce, about what the schedule needs to look like, about what resources are needed and how to message it. That's important, as long as everyone is being respectful, and as long as everyone is making sure, and this is especially important, to create space for people who might not be as loud or as comfortable sharing their opinions to still be able to contribute to the conversation. That debate, that argument, that dissonance is critical for getting to consensus on what the right path is. And I don't mean consensus in the sense that everyone needs to fully agree with it, but consensus in the sense that you have actionable agreement from enough stakeholders to be able to move forward. But critically here is that once you do have that consensus, even if one of your stakeholders dissents, they don't think this is the right path forward, it's important that they still need to be all in on executing it regardless. Because the only thing that'll make you move slower than heading in the wrong direction is if everyone is heading in their own direction. At least if you're all rowing together, the ship is moving. So try to make sure that even the people who disagree are at least all in on what was agreed upon, and that you're still taking the opportunity to reflect afterward what did go right, what did go wrong, and maybe those dissenters were correct. But at least you gave this the opportunity to succeed, and everybody gave it the best shot of succeeding so that you can take those lessons and do better next time. So make sure that you're tracking as much as you can. A little bit of documentation goes a long way. And studies show that you have more than 40% increased chance of sticking with something if you write it down. So it's not about keeping things permanent or immutable. This industry moves fast. It's one of the things that I love about it. I'm sure it's one of the things that many of you love about it too. So your project plan is going to need to change, and it will need to be adjusted with time. You need to be adaptable. You need to be nimble. That's one of our superpowers as small businesses. But the more that you write down, the easier it is to keep everybody working from the same playbook, the same assumptions, and the same information, so that you can all collaborate and help each other in whatever ways that you can. Makes it easy to refer back. It makes it easy to improve. And a little bit of automation goes an enormous way. I've said multiple times that time is one of the chief things we do not have enough of in this industry. And this can look like a lot of tasks to do, a lot of things to keep up with. If you have the right software, it's really, really not. And I don't even necessarily mean management software, but even something like Monday.com or like an Asana goes an enormous way towards really helping you keep everything organized. And on the net can save you a lot more time than the constant back and forth or constantly trying to figure out what you're doing from a standing start will be if you don't have any sort of planning, any sort of automation, anything to help keep all that data accurate. Even just being able to understand your raw materials inventory, what's fermenting, and what you actually have that's available and ready to sell can go a huge way towards making sure everybody has trust in what they're looking at and can contribute towards making the best decisions for the business. So good information and a little bit of automation can go a long way towards making this a huge time saver, even if it looks like you're adding tasks and adding the responsibilities on top of what your team's already got to do. But with that in mind, I'm going to go ahead and open this up for questions. If anybody who is tuned in does have any they'd like to ask. And leave that for just a minute. But if anybody does want to reach out, even offline, you can get me at any of the contact info that I did have up. But email, best way to get a hold of me is aaron.gore, aaron.gore @thefifthingredient.com. And you can also find me at Craft University, where we do separate webinars every single month on a variety of topics with a variety of expert panelists, as well as free tools and free resources. You can sign up at craftuniversity.beer. Absolutely free, and it does not matter if you're using any sort of software whatsoever. We want it to be actionable and useful to anybody who may be involved. But with that in mind, thank you so much, Andrew, and everyone else at Craft Beer Professionals for having me on. Thank you, everyone who has tuned in, and looking forward to seeing everyone around the industry.
Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this session, we'd love to see you in real life. We host in-person workshops across the country for craft beer professionals just like you that are held in some of the most exciting beer destinations around. These immersive events are designed to help you grow and connect with others. You'll meet peers from across the country and leave with actionable strategies for success. Connection has never been more important, and you can learn more at cbpconnects.com. Cheers. See you there.